coming. I'm Sam Volchenboum. I'm a pediatric oncologist. I'm at University of Chicago. And at University of Chicago, I direct our Center for Research Informatics, which is a group that provides all the informatics support for research throughout the division, supporting clinical trials, bioinformatics, high-performance computing, data warehousing, analytics. And I'm also the co-founder and chief science officer at Litmus Health. And so today we're going to talk about quality of life. And we're going to talk about what quality of life is and what health-related quality of life means. We're going to talk about the FDA and patient-reported outcomes and the problem with patient-reported outcomes for anybody who has been in or works on clinical trials. This will all, I think, ring true to those of you who work on this. And then finally, some ideas I have about how we might be able to start measuring quality of life better. So what is health-related quality of life and why does it matter? I think an example will illustrate some of the problems here in trying to understand how you measure quality of life. So think about surgery for a sarcoma in the leg. And for many years, the traditional surgery was to do a limb-sparing procedure where you would operate, you would take out as much of the tumor as you could, but you try to spare the limb. You would use a cadaver implant of bone, or you'd use some sort of prosthetic, but you would try to spare the leg during the surgery, and then you'd follow that up with radiation. And the other way to treat sarcoma would be just to perform an amputation and put the patient in a prosthetic. And of course, everybody assumed that when given the option, somebody would much rather save their leg than have a prosthetic. And it was assumed that we should always try to do a limb-sparing procedure rather than go right to amputation. And so the question was, does sparing a limb as opposed to amputating it offer a quality of life advantage? And when they surveyed the patients after they had gone through one of these procedures, surprisingly, more patients said that it was better that they had the amputation. And the reasons were that when you do a limb-sparing procedure, you're often faced with lots of pain, enduring infections. It takes a long time to get into your prosthetic. And it took patients a long time to get back to their normal activities when they would have the limb-sparing procedure versus the amputation. So in retrospect, patients' quality of life was actually being affected more by the limb-sparing procedure. And this was an unexpected finding. There is a spectrum of health-related quality of life, and one definition to think about is what's the person's expected physical, emotional, and social well-being, and how is it affected by their treatment? We can think about things like their biologic condition or their symptoms. Do they have Crohn's disease, for instance? What is their symptom status? Are they having pain? Are they sleeping? What's their functional status? Can they go on vacation? Can they go to work? Maybe we can ask them, what is your general perception of your health? And then how can we roll all those things up into a single metric that defines what their overall quality of life is? But it can be difficult to measure. Think about an elderly person who is at home, is lonely, has nobody to take care of them. They have nobody in their life. They never leave their house. And let's say they have diabetes and they end up having their foot amputated. All of a sudden, this person has people visiting them every day, taking them to the doctor, helping them with their food and shopping. People are coming to visit the house. Nurses are coming. You know, while in one metric you would say this patient now has a lot of pain and they've lost their mobility, on the other hand, if you talk to this patient, their actual quality of life may have gone up. They may now have a better overall quality of life now that they have all these social connections. Now, of course, that doesn't say much for our healthcare system that is what the situation is. But if you ask that person, their quality of life might go up. But if you're using traditional metrics and surveys of how's your pain and how well you're sleeping, you're going to miss the point here, which this person's quality of life is actually potentially better. So how do we measure quality of life today? It's usually done through patient-reported outcomes. So these are things like surveys. It's things like the nurse or the physician asking the patient questions about their quality of life. It's usually done by looking at the medical record, but it's really not done well by any means. And what I want to spend the rest of the time talking about is why is this broken and how can we improve it? Now, the FDA, of course, when they approve drugs, wants to approve drugs for indications, and those indications are usually things like curing the disease or patients living longer. And one of the things the FDA has not been overly concerned with over the years has been how the patient's quality of life is. And they're increasingly starting to approve more drugs based on quality of life measures. Oncology lags far behind, and so a review looking at the 160 drugs approved over a 4-year period or 5-year period, of those, 40 were oncology, and only 3 actually received a patient-reported outcome labeling, meaning that the indication said, if you take this drug, your pain will get better. If you take this drug, your sleep will get better. The FDA continues to put up some roadblocks, and they blame it on logistical hurdles and how you can set up an oncology study. And let's face it, it's hard to measure quality of life. It's expensive, it's a lot of work, and it's much easier to just measure the days of survival or how many hospital days they've had or how big the tumor is. It's difficult to measure quality of life. But there is some hopeful signs. So if you look at ruxolitinib, which is used to treat myelofibrosis, which is a type of bone marrow disease similar to leukemia, the primary endpoints for this study and for what the drug was approved for was a decrease in the spleen size, but also these endpoints up here of abdominal discomfort, pain, feeling full after you eat, getting night sweats, having bone and muscle pain. And so these are all quality of life metrics, and as you can see, the drug improved all these things, and the FDA actually put those in as indications for the drug and approved the drug based on those symptoms improving. More and more trials are incorporating patient-reported outcomes. So this was a trial in prostate cancer looking at androgen deprivation and whether it was done continuously or intermittently. And it was a phase 4 trial, and they actually had built-in quality of life measurements into the trial. So it wasn't just the size of the tumor or survival. They actually looked at things like impotence, libido, vitality, the patient's mental health, and how well they were physically functioning. And in the discussion, the authors in this paper say, our decision to include quality of life as a co-primary endpoint was based on the importance of improvements in quality of life, even if they occur in the context of similar efficacy. So that is a really important thing for these investigators to say. So what they're saying is that even though we know that this drug may improve survival, and we want to make sure that quality of life is taken to be just as important. And we're faced this when we offer treatments to our patients because oftentimes we're faced with competing treatments that we know one is going to be very painful, cause the patient to be very sick, but may extend their life, and we have other treatments that may not make them as sick but may not have as great of potential for life extension, and we have to try to figure out how to balance that conversation with patients. So why is this not working so far? Why is it so hard to measure quality of life? Well, the way that we collect patient-reported outcomes are outdated. So how do we do this now? If I want to measure somebody's sleep, how do we collect the data on that? Like this, right? We have clipboards, we have online surveys, we have sometimes mobile surveys if we're lucky. I see my patients in the waiting room. I see the kids and their parents furiously scribbling their diaries that they're supposed to have been filling out for 3 weeks. How did you sleep 3 weeks ago? I don't know. I don't know what I ate for breakfast this morning. And so these patients are having a really tough time recording their patient-reported outcomes, understanding how to get the point across about how they're feeling on a day-to-day basis. They have poor recall. As I said, these are proxy measures. So a patient saying that they didn't sleep well last night could be a proxy for them having reflux, could be a proxy for them having a lot of pain, could be a number of factors. So just asking the patient how they slept is not necessarily the best indication of the quality of their sleep. And of course, there's data error. So I'm doing a study now with the Children's Oncology Group, and we're sending out surveys. This is for long-term follow-up. And I said, well, let's just do the surveys on mobile REDCap so we can collect the data right into our system. Oh, no, forget about it. We can't do that. The sites aren't set up for it. We're going to do everything on paper. They'll send the surveys to us, and then we'll hand key in all the entries into a database here. Well, as you can imagine, there's going to be a lot of potential for error as we translate the data from one system into another. This is just an example of how sleep is currently monitored as the gold standard. So there's a survey, Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index from the late 80s, and it's a set of questions that patients are asked, and it basically asks you to recall how you slept over the last couple weeks. So imagine for you to sit and fill a survey to say, hey, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, how have you slept? Not a great way to measure your sleep. But this is the current gold standard. This is what the FDA accepts now for their trials. Intermittent data are unreliable. So a doctor might conduct a research study where quality of life sleep is an important quality of life metric. Sleep data could be collected every 2 weeks through a survey, but then they know that the data are unreliable. And then my friends in pharma tell me that they know the data are unreliable, but they just need the data so that they can send it back to the FDA. This whole system is really broken. The data are poor quality. There's a lot of misinformed decisions. And then, of course, we have poor drug design because they're being based on bad data. So what do we do? How are we going to measure health-related quality of life? So I'm a firm believer that using mobile apps and wearables and mobile devices are going to be a much better way to passively monitor many of these patient-reported outcomes where we can do a better measure of quality of life. The number of consumers wearing wearables is obviously skyrocketed. I get asked all the time from my patients what to do with the data from their wearables, and of course we don't have a lot of good ideas on what to do with the data. My friend from IBM is smiling because he hears the same thing, that we have all these data, but unless you have a system for tracking the data and then making inferences and modeling on the data, you really don't know what to do with it. Fitbit is very involved with a lot of corporate and insurance sponsors. Garmin is doing similar things with trying to get these into the hands of consumers to help measure their health care. And if you think about it, a lot of the things we want to measure are already around us. So there are ways to collect information on what we eat, how many times we go to the bathroom, how far we're walking every day, how much our pain is, how nauseated we are. There's so many different ways to collect all these data that it's inconceivable that we're still asking patients to remember how they slept 3 weeks ago. Passive data collection is going to be much more reliable. You put a patient on a study, you put a Fitbit on their wrist, you passively monitor how they're sleeping, and then the data will actually reflect what happened to the patient. So we're doing this right now. We have a study going at University of Chicago with their inflammatory bowel disease group. So we have a patient registry with 5,000 patients in it that have IBD. It's a clinical registry. It includes patient-reported outcomes. We also have a lot of omic data in there. So we have proteomic and genomic data in our system as well. Inflammatory bowel disease, which is Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. Quality of life factors include pain, sleep, ability to eat, and activity. Those are 4 very important quality of life metrics that need to be measured in any study looking at inflammatory bowel disease. So our study at University of Chicago, we have 100 patients enrolled, and we're measuring these metrics of quality of life. A research coordinator identifies patients that are eligible, and to be eligible, you just have to have IBD and have a cell phone. The research coordinator meets, verifies, gets consent, and then the patient's given a Fitbit. The app is downloaded, and then within the app, it connects to their Fitbit so that the data can be collected by the company to put all the data together. One of the most challenging things about this process, as you might imagine, was the IRB approval process and the contracting that had to happen. So Litmus worked with the University of Chicago. It took about 6 months to get all of the contracting in place. And a lot of the issues were around, obviously, patient privacy, but also the patient data. And hospitals, of course, consider data a valuable commodity, and they don't want their data flowing outside their systems if possible. So this took a lot of work to get in place. Obviously, managing my conflict was an issue, and so there's a whole other talk you could have on how doctors are trying to build these things and be entrepreneurs. It's also an issue at many institutions that I'm finding. So this took a long time to work up in the right way. There's a companion app that's written. So one of the nice things is that the app not only gives them the standard metric of what's the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, so it asks them every couple of weeks to go through the survey, but at the same time, we're measuring continuous Fitbit data for their pain, and for their sleep and their activity, and then every day we're asking them how they feel. So we're collecting all these parallel streams of data, and then we're putting it all together to try to report back how the patient's doing. It's very easy. Fitbit's got a great open API. It's very easy to leverage. More and more device makers are using this. The platform is device agnostic. If somebody wanted to use Garmin, they could use Garmin if they wanted to, as long as there's an API. This is actually my sleep data and my step data that I pulled down through their API. It's very straightforward. And then we provide a dashboard back to the researcher or to the physician. Here's how many patients are enrolled. Here's where they are in the trial. Here's how they're progressing. And then for patients that are, for each individual patient, we can track when did they not fill out their survey, when did they not wear their Fitbit. And of course, this is extremely valuable for the sponsors because compliance is a huge issue with clinical trials. And so seeing the patients like this is very valuable. So how does this help measure health-related quality of life? It's still very difficult to measure, and it's going to continue to be difficult to measure, but passive data collection is going to vastly improve how we handle the patient-reported outcome aspect of health-related quality of life. And I think actually collecting these multiple streams of data along with environmental data and other things that we can collect will help us define new quality of life metrics. So if we go back and we look at 1,000 Crohn's patients and we look at all of these continuous streams of data that we have along with information about their environment and information about their labs and their vitals and their healthcare, maybe we can build new quality of life metrics that we can measure much more accurately to help support clinical trials. And then the landscape is changing. I went to an FDA meeting a month ago, and I met with the FDA chair, and he's very enthusiastic about getting pharma to start using wearables in their trials, to have patient-reported outcomes be primary endpoints for trials. It's increasingly important to build these into your studies. And I think measuring this passively at the point of experience is really going to change how we conduct clinical trials. So I'm very excited to help push this and move it forward. And so I'll take any questions, and I'm happy to chat more. Thanks. In the back there. Yeah, so certainly it's an issue that, so the modeling of the error is something we're very interested in doing because in addition to that, there's obviously a lot of problems with people not wearing it sometimes, with people putting it on their dog. I mean, who knows what they're going to do with it. So being able to predict, to look at the, to know that there's always going to be a spectrum of data and to know what we expect and then to compare it to other things that they have. So I'm not directly answering your question, I know, but we can compare like their Fitbit data to their cell phone GPS data. So if they say they walk 10,000 steps, but their cell phone said that they walked a block, we know that there's a discrepancy there. There's obviously going to be some acclimation effect to wearing the devices. One of the things that we're working with Garmin on, for instance, is that like if we can use a continuous glucose monitor, for instance, we want to be able to turn off the fact that, this is with Medtronic, that we can turn off that they can see the glucose because we don't want the patient to see it. So Garmin actually has a device where you can actually, through the firmware, turn off the display so they can't see the step count and it can just report back for the trial. So it's sort of getting at it, but you do have a good point. Yep. Hi. Yeah, so two things. So obviously when these PROs are developed, they're developed with a very specific population. And so like when the Pittsburgh Sleep Index, they brought people in and did EEGs on them and they compared it to how they were sleeping by EEG. They showed that it was a good proxy measurement. So obviously they're not targeted at special populations. And so the other side of it is that what the FDA wants to see, you know all this, is that the FDA wants special panels on health-related quality of life for disease. So there's a whole Crohn's position paper, or ulcerative colitis and Crohn's from the FDA saying, here's how we want to measure quality in those populations. So I'm wondering, couldn't you just do a deep dive into that population group and say, okay, we want to use a Fitbit to monitor sleep and pain or sleep and activity, and then see how it correlates with traditional metrics? I guess you'd have to do something like that. But I think that's, especially in populations where they're not going to be as able to fill out traditional metrics that we have, maybe building a whole set of data around the passive data collection will be even better because nobody's done that yet. So imagine, so take 200 patients and give them all Fitbits and start collecting the data and correlate it to their exams and their findings. That's a great idea. We could do that study together. Yeah. That'd be good. Yeah. Right. So it comes down, so that's one of the most common questions that I get asked, and it comes down to being able to model the error associated with the device, because no device is going to be perfect. The FDA has said is that it does not matter if these devices are FDA approved. What matters is that you've done the validation studies to show that what they're measuring is what you think they're measuring. And so if you say you're measuring somebody's sleep and the number of times they've woken up, that has to be correlated to a traditional metric or correlated to something that shows that it's actually measuring that. So we've gone to great lengths at least to say that. Now, when it really comes to FDA, if they're actually going to practice what they preach, that hasn't been tested yet. I'm happy to answer more questions later or stick around or email. Thanks.